nearest continental neighbour to the ancient kingdom of Scotland is Norway. 300 miles to the east of the Bochum coast, less than 200 miles east of Shetland. Across the grey waters of the North Sea for over 2 centuries came the Vikings in their longboats to plunder and pillage. The Norsemen and the Scots struggled for supremacy in the Northern Isles and the islands of the West. And on one such island, Iona, the ancient kings of Scotland and Norway today lie side by side. This is the fierce and fiery prelude to the story of Royal Scotland, told with the music of trumpets and bagpipes on the esplanade of Edinburgh Castle in the 44th Edinburgh Military Tattoo. August 950 years ago, King Duncan was killed near Elgin by the most celebrated murderer of all time, Macbeth. Crowned king, he reigned for 14 peaceful years.
The king is crowned.
And on an August evening 9 centuries later, Royal Scotland is celebrated by the pipes and drums of 9 Scottish regiments. The Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, the Scots Guards, the Royal Scots, the Royal Regiment, the Royal Highland Fusiliers, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, the Black Watch, the Royal Highland Regiment, the Queen's Own Highlanders, the Gordon Highlanders, and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, 185 in number, entering to a tune composed during the First World War by Pipe Major George S. MacLennan, the Gordon Highlanders, in honor of the Queen's much-loved grandfather, and called King George V's Army. Massed pipes and drums move into formation to the tune Prince Charles is Welcome to Loch Harbour, composed by Pipe Major Evan McRae, Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, and first played before Prince Charles by Loch Harbour school children in the year of the Queen's Silver Jubilee, 1977. loved of all slow airs, the Sky Boat Song, arranged by Captain Gavin Stoddart, Director of Army Bagpipe Music. The Strathspey, Balmoral Castle, the Wheel Dancing Feet, the Slow Air, Ginna Was a Baron's Heir, and finally the jig, the Bobs from Balmoral, Bob Brown and Bob Nickel, in their time gillies, gamekeepers and pipers to Her Majesty the Queen on the Balmoral estate. Warm applause, as always, for the massed pipes and drums, the highlight of the evening for many of the 8 million people from all over the world who, across the years, have sat in the stands here high above Edinburgh. Rather more friendly and welcome visitors from across the North Sea. On their 4th visit to the Edinburgh Military Tattoo, 100 young men and musicians of His Majesty the King of Norway's Guard enter across the drawbridge to their regimental march. This is Valdresmarsh, named after one of the central regions of the Norwegian kingdom. Military service is compulsory for all young men in Norway. For women, it's voluntary. Initial service lasts 12 to 15 months and is followed by regular refresher training until the age of 44. After the first 12-week training as Army recruits, outstanding volunteers are chosen for the much sought-after privilege of serving in the 800-strong King's Guard. After a year, they're free to return to their schools, colleges and universities. The uniform is based on that worn by the Norwegian Guard companies sent to Stockholm to protect the Norwegian-Swedish king in 1860.
Ladies and gentlemen, all the members of the Guard you see tonight are young conscripts aged between 18 and 20 who joined the Norwegian Army in January and became members of the King's Guard in April. They spent a mere 6 weeks preparing their skillful display.
The rifles are American M1s. Each weighs 5 kilos or 10 pounds. Since the Kongensgårde were last here in 1987, the Norwegians have a new king, King Harald V, the first Norwegian king to be born in Norway. succeeded his father, King Olaf, in January 1991. The Guard wear the new cipher, H5, Harold V, on their caps. King Harold, who was 56, inspected his Guard a few weeks ago in June. And at the end of this month, His Majesty, King Harold and Queen Sonia will be celebrating their silver wedding. We send them good wishes from the capital city of a country for which his father, King Olaf, had such great affection, and from which he sailed home to a liberated Norway as Crown Prince in 1945. Jäger's March, the old Hunter's March, followed by a drum salute composed by the young members of the music corps themselves. Well, a fine display, and what a charming tribute. Scotland and Norway are good friends indeed. In this month of August, 936 years ago, Macbeth was killed by Duncan's son, Malcolm Canmore. He became king, and in 1069 married an English princess born in Hungary, who had been shipwrecked in the Firth of Forth. They lived happily in Edinburgh Castle, where Queen Margaret, who was a good and kindly woman, built a chapel. A little Norman chapel bearing her name is there to this day, the oldest building in the castle. Saint Margaret, as later generations called her, died here 900 years ago on hearing of the death in battle of her husband. 3 of her sons became kings of Scots. And there are Scots aplenty in this year's display of Highland and Scottish country dancing by the 148 tattoo dancers from all over Scotland. From Edinburgh, Perth and Stirling, from Aberdeen, Stonehaven and Fife, from Glasgow and the Lothians. The youngest of the Highland dancers, or competitors in local Highland games and gatherings, is 12 years old. And the dancers are accompanied by 30 fiddlers from the Lothian Schools Strathspey and Reel Society, founded just 10 years ago by their conductor, Isla Stephen. The tunes include Bonnie Bankery, The Auld Wheel, The Laird of Drumblair, The Iron Man, and Departy's Jean. Well played and gracefully and energetically danced. Not easy on the sloping hilltop esplanade of Tarmac Adam. From New Zealand, from Wellington, on their third visit to Edinburgh, the first for 10 years, the Lochiel marching team. This particular kind of marching, as a competitive sport, was pioneered 60 years ago in New Zealand. It bears little resemblance to square bashing, and is also quite different to the baton twirling and the majorette routines so popular in North America. As you see the intricate patterns and movements merge and dissolve before your eyes, have a thought for the team's skill, the fitness and the extraordinary feat of memory required to make anything look so perfect. The music is provided by the Wanganui City Brass from the west coast of New Zealand's North Island, the champion marching band of New Zealand in 1992. 12 of its musicians are under 20, the youngest just 16. And have a smile to yourself as you count the tunes they managed to squeeze in. Everything from Coming Through the Rye to the Hallelujah Chorus, with the 1812 Overture and God Defend New Zealand thrown in. From New Zealand, the Lochiel Marching Team and the Wanganui City Brass. This castle holds much of the romance and tragedy of royal Scotland. In a small room here on the 19th of June, 1566, Mary, Queen of Scots, gave birth to a boy. She called him James, and legend has it that as she held the tiny bairn, she said, "This is the prince who I hope will be the first to unite the kingdoms of Scotland and England." 37 years later, in 1603, James VI, King of Scots, became also King James I of England. And history is still made here at Edinburgh Castle. Tonight, a very proud but sad piece of history. As for the last time at an Edinburgh military tattoo, the regimental bands of all 7 regiments of the Scottish Division cross the drawbridge together to the 79th's farewell to Gibraltar. Next year, the regimental bands cease to exist and only 2 bands will remain, one Highland and one Lowland. The bands are joined by the pipes and drums of the 7 regiments, 250 men in all. A sight and a sound to remember. Strange to think that it's only 20 years ago that this combination of pipes and drums and military bands became so hugely popular. In the medley, Marching for Scotland, arranged by Captain David Thompson, Director of Music Infantry North, you'll hear Forward na Fecht for Charlie, The Dark Island, Mary's Wedding, The Old Rustic Bridge, Scots Way, and The Drunken Piper, or Highland Rory. Amazing Grace, in which the mass bands were joined by the Cadet Choir, conductor Alex Elric, MBE, regimental band and the pipes and drums of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, the pipes and drums of 2nd Battalion Scots Guards and Aberdeen University, OTC.
March, march, by the centre! Quick, march!
The mass bands and massed pipes and drums play the Green Hills of Tyrol. The honours of Scotland are the oldest crown jewels in the United Kingdom. The crown, in its present form, dates from 1540. The sceptre was given by the Pope in 1494. And the sword of state, still carried before the sovereign at processions of the Order of the Thistle, was given to James IV on Easter Day, 1507. After the union of the Parliaments of Scotland and England 200 years later, the honours, locked in an oak chest within the castle, were virtually forgotten, until in February 1818, in the presence of Sir Walter Scott, they were rediscovered and revealed in all their ancient splendour.
It is now 1822, and for the first time for over 150 years, a reigning British monarch, King George IV, is making a visit to Scotland, while from the battlements of the castle, a royal salute greets the King. His Majesty has arrived.
What a thrill for the tattoo audience here to see the Scottish state coach in all its splendour. It appears by gracious permission of Her Majesty the Queen. The roof of the state coach bears a representation of the Scottish crown. First made only 8 years after George IV came to Scotland, it came into the ownership of the Queen's grandmother, Queen Mary, in 1920. The coach was completely renovated and remodelled in the 1960s and was first used by the Queen on the 20th of May 1969 at the opening of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, just a couple of hundred yards below the castle here. King George IV. And an equally great thrill to have the Household Cavalry back in the tattoo for the first time in over 20 years. A great drum horse of the Blues and Royals, carries the priceless silver kettle drums presented to the Royal Horse Guards on St. George's Day, 1805, by George IV's father, King George III. All household cavalry horses are aged between 6 and 20 and stand 16 hands high. That's 5 feet 4 inches at the shoulder. Mostly they come from Ireland. And they're all black except for the trumpeters, who since the 17th century have ridden greys. The Blues and Royals were formed in 1969 by the amalgamation of the Royal Horse Guards, the Blues, and the Royal Dragoon Guards. Last autumn, almost a year ago, they formed a union with the Life Guards in the Household Cavalry Regiment. The great drum horse of the Blues and Royals, Belisarius, a 14-year-old blue roan, has come home after 10 years. He was born in Fife and joined the army when he was 4. A Scottish medley from the mounted band of the Blues and Royals. Now, to the tunes, Captain Campbell and the Piper of Dundee, come the Lochiel Marching Team from New Zealand. And they are followed by His Majesty the King of Norway's Guard, with their regimental colour. The Scottish Country Dancers and the Highland Dancers. Over 700 performers gathered in this incomparable setting. 30 years before George IV, bedecked in tartan, came to Scotland for the first time in 1822, a song had been published in the 4th volume of Johnson's Scots Musical Museum. It was by one Robert Burns, and it was called Ye Banks and Braes. Bob Garrity, Director of Music, the Blues and Royals, and Director of Music off the 1993 Edinburgh Military Tattoo. Also from the pen of Robert Burns, a song he took down from an old man's singing and refashioned to become the whole world's song of parting.
Hands across, ladies and gentlemen.
The parade comes to attention, the crowd stand, and the Guard of Honor will present arms for the singing of the national anthem. The colors are lowered, and high up on the rooftop above the shrine, Scotland's National War Memorial, a lone piper, Corporal Colin Gotterson, the Black Watch, plays Mist-Covered Mountains.
Scotland the Brave!
And so we take our leave of His Majesty's Kongens Gård from Norway, the Lochiel marching team and the Wanganui City Brass from New Zealand. And last of all, pride of place to the massed pipes and drums as they play the traditional Jock's Return to Barracks at the end of the day, the Black Bear, And wherever you've been watching, from high above Edinburgh in its 47th year of festival, this is Tom Fleming, wishing that you fare well and hoping that you will join us next year, same place, same leaf of the calendar, for the 45th Edinburgh Military Tattoo.